A single line in the Book of Enoch describes souls that fire does not destroy, it releases them. The church removed that book in 364 CE, banned it, called it dangerous. For 17 centuries, the same church taught that a body must stay whole, that burning it was a sin worth punishment. But the oldest surviving copy of Enoch, written in J.I.S. and locked in a stone chapel in Ethiopia, preserves a category of the dead the fire was meant to free. And the practice that would have freed them was buried along with the book. The Book of Enoch was voted out of Scripture at the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE. Banned, hidden, called too dangerous for ordinary teaching. When the Dead Sea Scrolls surfaced at Qumran in 1947, 11 separate copies of Enoch turned up, more than most books that stayed in the Old Testament. Two of the oldest fragments, catalogued 4Q 201 and 4Q 204, preserve Aramaic text from the earliest section of the book, and carbon dating places them well before the birth of Christ. And in that section, Enoch does something no other ancient Jewish text does. He describes where the dead are kept, how they are sorted, and what happens to the ones fire is allowed to touch. Not in symbols. In the flat, measured language of someone describing a place he was taken to and shown. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker. And I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of the burial doctrine the church built to replace what Enoch taught about fire, the exact chapter the Ge'ez manuscript keeps, and the Latin editions drop. The council that ruled the body must remain whole, and the year it did, the written penalty one emperor set for anyone who burned a corpse instead of burying it, copied line for line. I put it all into a written document. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. Start with the geography of the dead, because Enoch is the only ancient source that maps it. Chapter 22 describes a mountain in the west with hollow places carved into it, and Enoch is shown 4 of them. The angel Raphael walks him through the layout the way a keeper walks a visitor through a facility. The Ge'ez says the places are smooth, deep, and dark, cut into the rock and closed off from one another. Verse 9 states plainly that the hollow places were created for this exact purpose, that the spirits of the dead might be separated within them. Not one holding area. 4, each one built for a different kind of soul, and each one sealed off from the others. The first hollow place holds the righteous. The text gives it a bright spring of water, light, and rest, and the spirits there wait in comfort for the judgment. The second holds sinners who died without being punished in life, and it is dry and hard. The third holds a category the standard English editions blur almost past recognition, the ones who suffered and cried out and whose case is still open. And the fourth holds the ones this entire investigation turns on. Dr. Michael Knibb, whose 1978 Oxford translation remains the scholarly standard, noted that Chapter 22 preserves a system of the afterlife far more detailed than anything in the books that stayed in the Bible. The dead are not simply asleep in the ground. They are held, sorted, and assigned to a compartment, and each compartment has its own conditions and its own fate. Then comes the detail the church could not tolerate. Enoch does not treat the body as the person. He treats it as a container. The spirit is what continues, and the body is what holds it in place until judgment. Dr. George Nicholsburg, in his Fortress Press commentary on Enoch, described this as one of the oldest worked-out doctrines of the separable soul in the Jewish tradition, older than most of what later theology built on top of it. The person survives death. The body is the vessel that keeps the spirit anchored to a location until it is time. And this is where the fire enters, because if the body is a container, then destroying the container does something to what is inside. Chapter 108, the final chapter of the Ethiopian text, is the one most English readers never reach. It sits at the very end of the manuscript, after the sections everyone quotes, and it describes a place of fire, and it describes a category of the dead who are not consumed by that fire but changed by it. Dr. Ephraim Isaac, who produced his translation directly from the Ge'ez manuscripts in 1983, rendered chapter 108 with a precision the older editions smoothed over. The passage describes the spirits of the humble, the ones who did not chase gold, who gave their bodies over to hardship in life and blessed God through it. The text says, God will bring them out of the darkness into a shining light, that they will be clothed in that light, and that they will shine, and the Ge'ez pushes the image to a place the English versions pull back from. The released spirit and the fire become the same substance, not burned by fire, made into it. The older R.H. Charles' translation of 1906, the one most people still quote, kept the shining, and dropped the harder line, the one where the transfigured spirit and the flame are no longer distinct. Charles was working from a theological world that had already decided what the dead were allowed to be, and a soul that becomes fire did not fit inside it. So the line got softened into metaphor, and the metaphor got quoted for 100 years. But the manuscript Isaac worked from does not read as metaphor. It reads as mechanism, the same way the rest of Enoch reads as mechanism, flat and specific and strange. That is the teaching, stated as plainly as the text states it. There is a category of the dead that fire does not punish. Fire finishes them. It completes a release that the intact body was holding back. And to see how deliberate that language is, look at what Enoch does with fire everywhere else in the book, because he uses it two ways, and the two ways never blur together. For the Watchers, the fallen angels of chapter 10, fire is pure punishment. Azazel is bound hand and foot and reserved in darkness, and on the day of judgment he is cast into the fire to be destroyed forever. Chapter 90 describes an abyss full of fire where the condemned are thrown and consumed. That fire annihilates. It is the end of a thing that is not allowed to continue. But the fire in chapter 108 does the opposite to a different category. Same element, opposite result. On the condemned it is destruction. On the humble righteous it is transfiguration, the doorway out of the dark, and into the light they become. Enoch is not confused about fire. He is drawing a line straight through it. Fire destroys one class of the dead and completes another, and the entire question of what happens to you turns on which side of that line your spirit was sorted onto. And once you see that line clearly, a second question arrives on its own. If fire completes the release of certain souls, then what did the surviving practice look like, and why did every record of it get pulled out of the same book at the same time? Before we move on to the next passage, stop for a second. What you just heard about the fourth hollow place and the fire that empties it is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original Giez passage. The sealed category. The releasing fire. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. Now, follow what happened to the practice, because a teaching like this does not float free. If Enoch preserved a doctrine that fire releases a certain class of soul, that doctrine had a ritual attached to it, and the ritual that fits is the one the church spent 1,000 years stamping out: cremation. In the world Enoch was written into, burning the dead was not universal, but it was not forbidden either. It appears across the ancient Near East, across Greece, across the early Roman world, sitting side by side with burial for centuries without controversy. Then, over the first 4 centuries of the Common Era, it vanishes from Christendom almost entirely, and it vanishes on purpose. The reason given was doctrine. The church taught the resurrection of the body, the literal raising of the physical form at the end of days, and a body reduced to ash was, in that framework, a body that could not be raised whole. So the intact corpse became the rule. Burial became the only sanctioned path, and burning became an act of defiance against the resurrection itself. This is the same period, and the same instinct, that produced the removal of Enoch. Nickelsburg traced how the early church took the wide, strange afterlife of texts like Enoch, the 4 hollow places, the sordid spirits, the releasing fire, and narrowed all of it down into a single approved shape: keep the body whole and wait. Everything that did not serve that instruction was pushed to the edge of the canon and then over it. Jerome, compiling the Latin Vulgate around 400 CE, dismissed the parts of Enoch that described the machinery of the afterlife as unworthy of serious study. Augustine, writing in the City of God around 410, argued that Enoch's descriptions should be read as moral allegory rather than as accounts of real places with real compartments. Neither man engaged with what the text actually specified. They did not argue that Enoch was wrong about the hollow places. They argued that the hollow places should not be read as hollow places at all. The concrete became symbolic by decree, and once it was symbolic, the ritual attached to it had nothing left to stand on. And the specialists who spent their lives on these texts saw the pattern and mostly stepped around it. Joseph Millick, who edited the Aramaic Enoch fragments from Qumran, treated the afterlife passages as the least urgent material in the collection, published late and framed as elaboration rather than testimony. James Vanderkam, one of the foremost living authorities on Enoch, has documented again and again how much of the Giez tradition never made it cleanly into the Western editions at all. The result is that the plainest chapters, the ones about compartments and fire, are the ones an ordinary reader is least likely to ever encounter in the form the manuscript actually preserves. The enforcement was not gentle, and when the practice refused to die on its own, law finished the job. In 785, in the capitulary he issued for the conquered Saxons, the Emperor Charlemagne set the penalty for burning the dead according to pagan rite. Not a fine, not penance, death. The document survives. It is a matter of record, the same way the council is a matter of record. Read that line against the Enoch teaching and the shape of it becomes hard to look away from. The one act that the text says completes the release of a certain soul is the exact act a Christian emperor made a capital crime. The church did not merely prefer burial. It was willing to kill to prevent the alternative. And it wrote the willingness down, and it stayed that way for over 1,000 years. The Catholic Church did not lift its formal prohibition on cremation until 1963, and even then, it kept warning against choosing fire for any reason that denied the resurrection of the body. 17 centuries after Enoch was pulled from the canon, the institution that pulled it was still guarding the same border, still insisting the body stay whole, still treating fire as the enemy of what survives death. The book and the practice were removed together, in the same centuries, by the same reasoning, and they were kept removed together for the same span of time. That is not two separate stories that happen to rhyme. It is one decision, applied twice. But the strangest confirmation does not come from Enoch at all. It comes from the two civilizations on either side of it, because both of them understood the body as a container, and both of them built their entire death system around controlling exactly what fire could reach. Start with Egypt, because Egypt went the opposite direction, and the opposite direction proves the point. The Egyptians did not burn the dead. They preserved them with an obsession that has no equal in the ancient world, and the reason was not sentiment. It was mechanics. Jan Assmann, whose study of the Egyptian concept of the soul reshaped the entire field, described a person as made of separable parts that death pulls apart. The Ka, the life force that had to be sustained with offerings. The Ba, the mobile spirit that could leave the body and return to it, usually shown as a bird with a human face. And the Ach, the transfigured one, the version of the dead that becomes effective and luminous, a being of light and radiance. The word itself carries the sense of shining. The Egyptian dead did not simply survive. The successful ones were meant to become a shining thing, and the entire funerary apparatus existed to make that transformation happen correctly. Here is the part that lines up with Enoch. The Egyptians believed the Ach, the shining transfigured spirit, could only form if the body was preserved as its anchor. Destroy the body carelessly, and you did not free the spirit, you stranded it. So mummification was not decoration, and it was not superstition. It was a system built to hold the Ba to its anchor so that the Ach could form in a controlled way, over time, under ritual supervision, rather than being released all at once and unsupervised. Egypt and Enoch agree on the machinery exactly. The body holds the spirit. What differs between them is only the choice. Enoch preserves a category the fire is meant to release. Egypt built an entire priesthood to make sure that release never happened by accident. And there is a detail in the Egyptian material that Western summaries almost always drop. The one thing the Egyptians feared most for the dead was the second death, annihilation in a lake of fire in the underworld, a fire reserved for the condemned who failed the weighing of the heart. The Book of the Dead describes it, guarded and burning, the place where a failed soul is destroyed so completely that nothing continues. But the same texts also place fire in the hands of the blessed, torches and flames that light the path of the transfigured through the underworld. Fire was not simply good or simply bad in Egyptian thought. It was the mechanism. In the wrong place, applied to the wrong category, it annihilated the soul entirely. In the right place, applied to the right category, it transfigured. That is the same distinction Enoch draws in chapter 108, the same line running straight through the flame. And the sorting was not automatic. Spell 125 of the Book of the Dead describes the weighing of the heart, the moment where the heart of the dead is set on a scale against the feather of truth. Pass, and the soul goes on toward the light and the transfigured state. Fail, and the waiting creature devours it, and the second death takes it in the fire. The Egyptians built an entire courtroom into the afterlife for one reason: to decide which category a soul belonged to before anything was allowed to touch it. Enoch describes the compartments. Egypt describes the trial that assigns them. Same architecture, told from a different seat. Now cross to the other side, to Mesopotamia, because the Babylonian system draws the line from the opposite direction and lands on the same border. Thorkild Jacobson, whose analysis of Mesopotamian cosmology remains a foundation of the field, described a netherworld that every spirit descended into, a house of dust from which there was no easy return, and a spirit, the Atemu, that depended on the body being properly buried and regularly get the burial wrong or fail to leave the offerings, and the Atemu became a restless ghost, a thing that wandered back into the world and afflicted the living with sickness and misfortune. The body had to be placed correctly, in the ground, with the offerings maintained, or the spirit could not settle into its place below. And burning had a specific and terrible role in that system. To burn a body completely, in much of Mesopotamian thought, was to destroy the spirit's anchor so thoroughly that it had no descent at all, no netherworld, no rest, nothing. Fire was used as the ultimate punishment precisely because of what it was believed to do to the part that survives. A burned body did not produce a settled ghost or even a restless one. It produced nothing. Which means all three traditions, Enoch, Egypt, and Babylon, agree on one thing that the modern world forgot entirely. The treatment of the body is not neutral. What you do to the container decides what happens to what it held. Burial holds the spirit in place. Fire acts on it. And the only thing any of these systems argues about is which souls the fire is allowed to touch, and what the touch of it does. The Babylonians backed that fear with ritual. The living owed the dead a steady maintenance, a rite called the kispu, food and water, and the speaking of the name, month after month, so the Atemu stayed fed and stayed settled below. A body that had been burned to nothing had no place to receive any of it. There was no mouth to feed, no name anchored to a spot in the ground, no way for the offerings to reach anyone at all. The fire did not send the spirit somewhere worse. It cut the spirit off from the entire system, which to a Babylonian was worse than any punishment inside it. Once again, the assumption underneath is identical. The body is the anchor, and fire is what severs the anchor. They simply drew the opposite conclusion about whether severing it was mercy or ruin. That agreement is the thing that should not exist. 3 civilizations, 3 separate priesthoods, 3 languages, no shared scripture between them, separated by deserts and centuries, and all 3 built their most important ritual around the same buried assumption. The body is a container, and fire is the tool that empties it. Egypt guarded against the emptying, Babylon punished with it. And Enoch is simply the one text that states the assumption out loud, names the category the fire is meant to free, describes the compartment that category waits in, and gets removed from the canon for saying it in language too plain to turn into metaphor. And that plainness is exactly what made it dangerous. An abstract afterlife cannot be checked. A soul that goes to an undefined heaven or an undefined hell asks nothing of you and can be believed or doubted without any consequence. But Enoch does not describe an undefined anything. He describes compartments with conditions, a sorting with rules, and a specific physical act that changes the outcome for a specific class of the dead. A claim like that can be acted on. It can be practiced. And a doctrine that can be practiced is far harder to control than one that can only be preached. The church did not remove Enoch because it was vague. It removed Enoch because it was operational. Now, let me be clear about what I am not claiming. I am not saying that cremation is a secret sacrament, or that burning a body performs some guaranteed release of the soul, or that the church invented burial purely to trap the dead. The Book of Enoch is not a crematorium manual. The doctrine of bodily resurrection is a sincere theological position held for sincere reasons across 2,000 years, and burial has meant love and dignity and grief to billions of people who never thought about any of this and never needed to. None of that is in dispute, and none of it should be. But what the text describes, when you read it in the oldest surviving form, rather than the softened one, is a specific claim, that the dead are sorted into sealed compartments. That one category is meant to be released by fire and completed by it, and that this teaching sat inside a book the church removed in the same centuries the church was making the burning of the dead a crime punishable by death. The removal of the book and the suppression of the practice are not 2 stories that happen to overlap. They are one story, and they run on a single timeline, from the council in the 4th century to the emperor in the 8th to the ban that did not lift until the 20th. Here is the piece that turns it from history into something closer to the present. For 17 centuries, fire lost. Burial was the law, the norm, the only respectable end, and the alternative was a crime, then a scandal, then simply unthinkable. And then, within living memory, the whole thing reversed. Cremation went from forbidden to permitted to common to dominant across most of the modern world, quietly, in a matter of decades, without anyone framing it as a return to anything at all. The practice the church once killed people to prevent is now the ordinary choice of the majority in country after country, chosen for cost and convenience and space, with the ancient reasoning long forgotten. Whatever border three ancient priesthoods guarded so carefully, the modern world walked straight across it without ever noticing the line was there. And the speed of it is the strange part. A prohibition that held for 17 centuries, enforced at times by execution, defended by councils and emperors and popes, dissolved in less than a single lifetime. No argument won it. No new revelation overturned the old doctrine. It simply stopped mattering to people, and the ground the church had defended so fiercely was crossed by nearly everyone, casually, for reasons that had nothing to do with the soul at all. Whatever Enoch was preserving, and whatever the church was suppressing, the modern world settled the fight by forgetting there had ever been one. Enoch had no crematorium, no doctrine of the parts of the soul worked out in a laboratory, no way to cross-check his own text against Egypt or Babylon. He wrote in Ge'ez and Aramaic, in fragments that ended up at Qumran under numbers like 4Q201 and 4Q204, and in a complete manuscript locked behind stone in a chapel in Ethiopia that has not left that building in centuries. He should not have known that the two civilizations flanking his own would build their death systems on the same assumption he set down in a single chapter. And yet the text sits there, saying what it has said for over 2,000 years. That the body is a container, that the dead are sorted, that there is a category the fire is meant to free, and a fire that is meant to free it. The manuscripts remain in Ethiopia, behind stone and restriction, read past the opening chapters by almost no one. The fragments sit in Jerusalem under glass, catalogued, studied, and quietly set aside, and rarely followed to the very end by almost anyone. The council that removed the book is a matter of record, and so is the year it did it. The law that made burning the dead a capital crime is a matter of record, and so is the emperor who signed his name to it. The date the church finally lifted the ban is a matter of record too, and it is more recent than most people would ever guess. And in a book that same church removed from the Bible 17 centuries ago, a man named Enoch stands on a mountain in the west, shown 4 sealed hollow places by an angel, told which souls wait in each one, and told which of them the fire was made to release. The compartments are still described exactly as he wrote them. The teaching is still there, in the oldest copy, in a language most of the world cannot read, and the practice that would have carried it out came back on its own, quietly, long after everyone who buried it was gone.